Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I would like to actually join with our co-sponsor at the Valley of the Sun Jewish Community Center in welcoming everyone to the first of three-part series, In Search of Ancient Israel with Professor Gary Rendsburg. I'm Stanley Mervis, the Director of Jewish Studies at ASU and the Harold and Jean Grossman Chair of Jewish Studies. The Center for Jewish Studies at ASU is committed to disseminating credible knowledge and fostering a culture of good faith discourse around Jews, Judaism, and the Jewish experience to our students, our faculty, our greater Phoenix community, and as widely as possible. Before I introduce Professor Rendsburg, I would like to first remind you all that this is the first of a three-part lecture series on ancient Israel. So I want to invite you all to join us on November 12th for the second part, In Search of David and Solomon, and then following that, Wednesday, November 19th, In Search of the Kingdoms of Israel and Judah. You should please make note that participants only need to register once to attend any or all of the program in this series. The series is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. We'll post each lecture within 7 days. Now let me introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Gary Rendsburg, serves as the Blanche and Irving Laurie Chair in Jewish History and holds the rank of Distinguished Professor in the Department of Jewish Studies at Rutgers University in New Jersey. His teaching and research focus on all things ancient Israel, primarily languages and literature, though also history and archaeology. His secondary interests include ancient Egypt, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Hebrew manuscript tradition. Professor Rendsburg is the author of 7 books and more than 200 articles. His most recent book is How the Bible is Written, which came out with Hendrickson Press in 2019, with particular attention to the use of language to create literature. In addition, he has produced 2 series for the Great Courses program, one on the Book of Genesis and one on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Plus, he lectures regularly for the Smithsonian Associates, One Day University, Context Travel, the Biblical Archaeology Society, and other adult education venues. Professor Rendsburg has visited all the major archaeological sites in Israel, Egypt, and Jordan. Plus, he has excavated at Tel Dor and Caesarea. He also has done extensive research on medieval Hebrew manuscripts at leading libraries, including the Bodleian Library in Oxford, the Cambridge University Library, the Vatican Library, the Library of Congress in Washington. During his career, Professor Rendsburg has served as visiting professor or visiting research scholar at the University of Oxford, the University of Cambridge, the University of Sydney, the Hebrew University, Bar-Ilan University, the University of Pennsylvania, UCLA, the Getty Villa, and the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome. So without further ado, I would like to hand this over to Professor Rendsburg, and we very much look forward to learning from you.
Thank you very much, Stan, and thank you to Lisa as well for all of the logistical work that goes into producing this 3-part series. We, just open up our Zoom and we think everything is going so smoothly, and we hope it always does. But of course, it always takes so much logistical work and organizational work. So I thank all of my friends and colleagues at Arizona State, and it's just such a pleasure to be with you this evening, U.S. time. I say that because as we were coming online, I saw a few people in the chat stating that they were zooming in from Israel and from Australia. So welcome to the 21st century, where we're able to share our knowledge so broadly via the technology that we have at our disposal. Exactly 1 year ago, I was actually in Phoenix. And thank you to my hosts then, which included a broad array of institutions from Scottsdale to Sun City West. I won't mention the names, although I know several of you are with us again this evening. So thank you personally for that great opportunity to spend a week in Phoenix to speak at various churches and synagogues and at ASU. And here we are 1 year later through the wonders of Zoom as we begin this 3-part series In Search of Ancient Israel. Starting this evening with In Search of Israelite Origins. We're going to go back to the very beginning, 3,200 years ago. I will present for about 35, 40 so many minutes, we're not sure, how long it will take, and then we'll take a break, a short 5 to 7 minute break halfway through the presentation, and I will invite questions from anyone who would like to ask a question about the first half of the program. Please put them in the Q&A, and then we'll feed them through the Q&A, and I'll answer them, hopefully all of them. But if we don't have enough time during this short break, I promise you that we'll end after an hour, 10, hour and 15 minutes into our program total, leaving us with 15, 20 minutes at the end until we conclude at around 8:30 Arizona time. So if you have any questions with anything that comes up at any time, first half or second half, please put them in the Q&A. You are looking at the most famous monument from ancient Egypt vis-a-vis the Bible, because this is the Merneptah stele, and you see the dates of this, the reign of this pharaoh. R period in my abbreviations will always mean reigned. So a little bit more than 3,200 years ago. It is, as we'll come back to this, it is the earliest mention of Israel outside the Bible. On this stela is the only mention of Israel in an ancient Egyptian text. It is housed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. It is, needless to say, of the most significance. I start with the lecture this evening with this great monument, but I am just giving you the forecourt, a little taste of what's to come, because we're going to actually start with something else and then come back to this when it fits into the narrative that I will produce for you and present to you this evening. So there are 6 items or 6 stages, if you will, of the biblical narrative which spans the first 6 books of the Bible. Not that one of these corresponds to each of the first 6 books, that's not the way it works. But if you read Genesis through Joshua, you can divide up the narrative into the 6 components that you see here, starting with the family origins, Abraham and his descendants, which takes up the main part of the book of Genesis. Now, this is a family story. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then the sons of Jacob, the most famous of whom was Joseph. At a distance of 32 or 3,300 years, it is almost impossible to find a reference to an Abraham or an Isaac or a Jacob in the ancient historical documentation. So we're going to quickly just note this and move on. If I can give you an analogy, 3,200 years from now, it may be possible to find a reference to America in the historical record, or Israel, or the Jews, or New Jersey, or Arizona. But the odds of finding Gary Rendsburg in the historical record 3,200 years from now is not very great. So to focus on a single family, all we can say is that this is where the biblical narrative begins, and we very quickly have to move on to item number 2 here. Famine sends people to Egypt. Now, this is at the end of the book of Genesis, and I'm assuming that you're all relatively familiar, if not very familiar, with the story of Joseph going down to Egypt first, sold by his brothers as a slave, and then eventually, in this very dramatic narrative, Joseph's brothers and his father Jacob and all of their families coming down to Egypt, where they live in the very last chapters of the book of Genesis. Here we can actually say something based on the historical record. What I'm attempting to do this evening is to take the biblical narrative, which you see charted here, and to slot into that narrative the documentation, textual and archaeological, where we can find similar material from Egypt, from the archaeological record, and so on, which informs the biblical story. Now, before we get to the first of these documents, I want to introduce you to the collection as a whole. They are called the Anastasi Papyri. It's a collection of about 20 different papyri. They were purchased by Giovanni Anastasi, a wealthy Greek merchant, who in the 19th century, somewhat oddly, served as the consul general for the joint Swedish-Norwegian delegation to Egypt. Now, this was a time period when you could buy anything on the antiquities market. Locals in Egypt and Iraq and elsewhere would simply find stuff in the ground and it could be sold to a dealer who could sell it to somebody else. And in fact, to be honest, this is how the great collections of Europe and America were built. The British Museum, the Louvre, and the Berlin Museum, the big three in Europe, the Metropolitan Museum, the Brooklyn Museum in New York City, and other collections were built in the 19th century. There was no legality preventing the sale of such antiquities, in fact, throughout much of the 20th century. So Giovanni Anastasi was just buying papyri wherever he could find them, and eventually he sold much of his collection to the British Museum and to other European institutions. We're going to focus mainly on the documents that are in the British Museum, although in one instance we will see something that's in the Netherlands. We begin with Papyrus Anastasi number 6, and by the way, I love the fact that these are still in their original Victorian era frames, that the British Museum has not updated them. They're perfectly fine. There's no need to conserve them or preserve them any better than you see them now. But I hope you can all admire sort of the century and a half ago as these documents arrived to London and the British Museum staff puts them in these frames under glass, and that's how they are still there today. Now, what's so important about Anastasi number 6? Here is a translation of a portion of it. It is the report of a frontier official to his superior. So you have to realize that the Egyptian government, the Egyptian empire, had a huge bureaucracy, no different than any other major nation state, including our own or any of the major nation states of the world today, where you have levels of bureaucrats who file reports with their superiors and so on. So our scribe Inanna, you see his name there in the first line, clearly from the context is on the frontier, Egypt's eastern frontier, more or less where the Suez Canal is today. And he's sending a dispatch back to his superior, a man named Kagab, about all that's been happening out there on the frontier. And in the course of reporting his the events of the day, he states in the middle paragraph that we have finished admitting the Shasu tribes of Edom at the fortress of Merneptah, which is in Cheku, to the pools of Per Atum, to keep them alive and to keep their flocks alive. Now, I'll get to the highlighted blue items in a moment, but I also want to focus on to keep them alive and to keep their flocks alive. And then you'll notice that you actually get a date, year 8 of the reign of the king, day 5 of the month, which is ascribed to the birth of the god Seth, and so on and so forth. So if it helps, imagine that this is the ancient equivalent of a modern INS official in the US, or the UK Border Patrol, or any of these government agencies where you have to process people who are coming into the country. Now, today we carry our passports and we get them stamped. Well, we don't get them stamped anymore. They just get scanned. But it's that kind of, the documentation is there that Gary entered the UK on such and such a date and so on. That's what this is 3,200 plus years ago. Now, who are the Shasu tribes? What is Edom? What is Paratum? Shasu is the ancient Egyptian word for nomads or Bedouin. Egypt, by the way, in antiquity was the Nile Valley. Today, it's more or less a squared off geographical section. You can all picture the map. But in antiquity, the Egyptians understood that Egypt meant the Nile Valley, and the deserts to the east and the west, stretching into the Sinai and so on, was the realm of the Bedouin and the nomads, and that wasn't Egypt per se, although the Egyptians may have controlled that region. So that's the Shasu. Edom is the country to the south of Israel, modern-day southern Jordan and Israel. So if you've gone through the Arava Valley, or if you've been to Petra in Jordan, that is the region of Edom. And Paratum, mentioned here as the city where these individuals were settled, is the ancient Egyptian equivalent of the city which is mentioned in the Bible as Pithom, Exodus 1:11, anglicized as Pithom, which is one of the two cities where the Israelites are living at the beginning of the book of Exodus. So the document that you see here is a striking parallel to the story you get in the book at the end of the book of Genesis and into the beginning of the book of Exodus, where the Israelites, whom I will demonstrate to you this evening, are a part of the Shasu movement, are settled in Pithom, Paratum, along with their flocks. The end of the book of Genesis describes the Israelites arriving in Egypt with their sheep and their goats. If I could magically cross out the word Edom here and write in the word Israel, which of course I wouldn't do, but if I were magically able to do that, very tempting, you would have the biblical story right in front of your eyes. And given the close relationship of Israel and Edom, which I will show you, this is not such a large step to cross out Edom and just say, oh, these are the Israelites. Now, what did this look like? Well, as my students will tell you, one of the refrains when I teach Intro to Bible, as I'm doing this semester, one of the refrains in class is the Bible does not come with pictures. It's words on a page. But Egypt comes with pictures. Now, this is about 500 or 600 years too early for the biblical story, but it's the tomb painting that we all show when we teach because it's the one we have. So it's from 1800 BCE, half a millennium or so too early for the biblical account. But it gives you the viewpoint of an Egyptian artist portraying the arrival of Semites coming into Egypt. Now, it's one single long continuous painting, which you see there on the bottom in black and white, but I've divided it up in the color image at the top. These are, in fact, in living color in these tombs at Beni Hassan, which is south of Cairo. You notice the domesticated animals, donkeys, goats, and so on. You will notice, excuse me, I'm sorry. You'll notice that the Semites have beards. Israelite and Semitic men were bearded, and the Egyptians are leading them in to their country. In fact, we are told the hieroglyphic inscription, which you see there, says there are 37 of them arriving in the country. It's a little bit cut off, but this is the hieroglyphs here for 37. And they are coming with peacefully, even though the gentleman on the upper left and the gentleman on the left have spears and a bow and so on. But they're coming in with a musical instrument and with bellows to do metal work, apparently. The families are coming as units, the children, the young children are riding on the donkey. It's a phenomenal picture. So imagine something like this to inform the picture we would get at the end of the book of Genesis, or for that matter, in Papyrus Anastasia number 6, which I just showed you. So we know, the bottom line is, we know that Egypt would open its doors to people from the land of Canaan, Semites, to come into the land with their flocks, with their donkeys, with their wives, with their children, whole family units coming in. We see that in the Papyrus Anastasia number 6 and in the tomb painting that I just showed you. Now, the next stage in the biblical narrative at the beginning of the book of Exodus, the new Pharaoh arises who knew not Joseph, and he begins to enslave the Israelites. Now, I call it the so-called slavery because a better term for this is corvée labor. Slavery, especially in an American context, connotes one human being owning another human being, part of our dishonorable pre-Civil War American history. But in ancient Israel and ancient Egypt and throughout the ancient Near East, yes, there were slaves. But the kind of slavery you get in the book of Exodus is what we call corvée labor, which is to say the entire entity of the people of Israel is serving as slaves to the entity of imperial Egypt. And you can see this in the biblical account because the Israelites are living as family units. The Israelites have their own foremen. They are subservient to the Egyptian taskmasters, but it's not like person A is owned by Egyptian person X and so on. So we call it corvée labor. Part of the problem is, by the way, that in Hebrew, eved can mean slave and servant and worker. So it's, not quite the slavery. I prefer to actually call it corvée labor. Now, what do we know from ancient Egypt about corvée labor? Well, here's another document from the time of Ramses II. This is Papyrus Leiden 348. This is the one that's in the Netherlands, which I mentioned earlier, which we believe also to have been sold by Anastasi. And it is a decree in this papyrus scroll. Here it is, by the way. You can, sorry, I don't have a picture of it, I guess. Nope, oops, I'm going the wrong direction. There we go. There it is, Papyrus Leiden 348. This is what it looks like. And it says, issue grain to the men of the army. Okay, typical bureaucratic command. And to the Apiru who are drawing stone for the great pylon of the house of Ramses. Now, Ramses is the second city where the Israelites live, clearly named for Ramses II, or perhaps for his grandfather, the founder of the dynasty, Ramses I, but it's built during the reign of the great Ramses II. And so Pithom is mentioned in one text that I showed you. Ramses is mentioned in this text that I showed you. Now, who are the Apiru? The Apiru are mentioned in a series of ancient Egyptian texts. They are people on the social margins. They appear in dozens and scores of texts. They also appear in Mesopotamian texts. And they are socially marginal people who dwell in the land in their host country, and they are employed as workers. So if the expression guest laborers means something to you, which is the term that's used in many of the European countries, in Germany in particular, Gastarbeiter, where you have people from the Middle East and Africa and so on working in various tasks, including construction, as you see here, or as we have in America, immigrants, especially from Latin America, Mexico, and countries to the south. You probably know it better in Arizona than I do in New Jersey, but even here in New Jersey we have it as well. And they're, almost invisible, but they are there in our society doing work that the locals do not want to do. That's the Apiru, as we can tell from the collection of texts from ancient Egypt that refers to the Apiru. Now, it is very possible that the word Hebrew, Avri, is in fact related to this term. I suspect that it is, although not all Apiru were Hebrews, to be sure. There are too many Apiru all over the place to actually be the Hebrews. But I suspect that the word Hebrew was a term that originated in the Apiru social class, but came to be used for a specific subgroup thereof who are identifiable as the people of Israel. In the Bible, by the way, the word Israel appears as the default, and the word Hebrew appears only occasionally, but it does appear in Exodus chapters 1 and 2, which is interesting because it gives us the time period that we're looking at right here. And there's Papyrus Leiden 348 once again. Leiden is the great university city of the Netherlands. So what Oxford and Cambridge are to England, what Heidelberg is to Germany, that's what Leiden is to the Netherlands. South of Amsterdam, not too far from The Hague. Okay, so here are the two cities on the map, Pithom and Ramses, where the Israelites settled, right here. Ramses in the eastern delta, on the eastern branch of the Nile in the delta, and Pithom off to the east on a wadi with a stream running through it, halfway between the Nile and what is now the Suez Canal as you enter the Sinai. So this is where the Israelites settle. The journey from the land of Canaan to that part of northern Egypt is not very great, but notice it's also where the Edomites would have settled, because this is the closest part of Egypt to the land of Canaan. You're in Egypt, you are being hosted by the government, you settle there, you gain work, you have food, you are able to establish your lives there. My colleague Manfred Bitak of the University of Vienna has excavated the site of Ramses. Its current name is Tel al-Daba in Arabic. Notice the lushness of the soil in the Nile Delta. And he has been digging there. He's now retired and he's handed off the project to his successors, his students and disciples. But he found remarkable material at the site, including evidence, no surprise, for Semitic lifestyle, Semitic material culture, slightly distinct in pottery and so on from the more standard Egyptian culture that you would find if you went to certainly Luxor in the far south, or even Memphis, which is south of modern-day Cairo. Now, let's fit into the narrative that I'm providing for you, the Merneptah stele with which I began. As I said, the earliest mention of Israel outside the Bible, the only mention of Israel in an ancient Egyptian text. A little backstory. It was found in 1896 by the great British archaeologist Sir Flinders Petrie. It's remained in Egypt. It is still housed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Petrie found it here in the mortuary temple of Merneptah on the west bank of the Nile, opposite Luxor/Thebes. This is the forecourt, and he found it in this area over here. Here's the entranceway. Now, most of this temple, as you can see, the walls have all come down. The stones have been removed, most likely by locals for building material and so on. But the floor plan is still there, so we get a sense of what this great temple looked like. It was built simply for the mummification of the pharaoh Merneptah, who was then buried not too far from here in the Valley of the Kings. And this is where Petrie found the stela in 1896. He immediately read it, and he produced, in the very same year that he found it, along with a colleague, he produced the line drawing that you see here. Excuse me. And this is published, as you can see, London, 1896, in what we call the Editio Princeps, first edition. The Gary Rendsburg School of Scholarship, which all my students learn, never say it in English if you can say it in Latin or in German. Editio Princeps, Latin for first edition. So, what does this inscription say? It is mainly, for 25 lines or so, a detailed description of Merneptah's victories over Libya, the country to the west of Egypt, as it still is today. There were a few lines left at the bottom down here, where the scribe added in brief, in summary fashion, the description of Merneptah's victories in the other direction, northeast into the land of Canaan. And in the next to last line, you have Israel written, and I've put the red text box around it there. This is what it says. The princes are prostrate, meaning the princes of Canaan, saying peace. By the way, when the scribe wrote peace here, he did not write the Egyptian word for peace. He wrote out the Canaanite/Hebrew word for peace. It actually says shalom in Egyptian hieroglyphs. In other words, it's just like we could write in English today, shalom. It's not a Hebrew, it's not an English word. I'm just writing the Hebrew out in our script. Similarly, the scribe wrote, isn't that wonderful? He wrote shalom out, peace, we surrender. And then it refers to Canaan in the fourth line. 3 cities are mentioned, Ashkelon, Gezer, and Yanoam. We know where Ashkelon and Gezer are. They're still on the map. We're not 100% sure where Yanoam is. And then Israel is mentioned. This is the only reference to Israel in any ancient Egyptian text. You can imagine in 1896, when this was found, that there was great excitement about this, obviously, and we remain excited to today. The only problem is, after the passage of 130 years, it would have been nice if we found another reference to Israel in some Egyptian document. We haven't yet. This remains the sole instance. This is the hieroglyphs written right to left. The line drawing, by the way, was published left to right because you can write hieroglyphs in either direction. The stela is actually written right to left, as I just showed you, with a close-up of the stone, but we publish everything left to right because we're typically publishing in English or French or German or Italian or whatever, and we write left to right. But here is the actual hieroglyphs right to left. Here they are right to left as well, and this spells out the word Israel. Now, the other entities which are mentioned in that text all use this hieroglyph right here. You see it here, you see it here, and you see it here. It's the foreign land classifier. In other words, you write out the word Canaan, you write out the word Ashkelon, and after it, you put a special symbol which tells you, according to the hieroglyphics writing system, You don't pronounce it, but it tells you that it's in the class of foreign land. If you don't know what the word Canaan means, because it's just spelt out phonetically here, this will tell you it's a foreign land. If you don't know what this Ashkelon is, oh, it's some foreign place. Ditto for Techenu. When Israel is written, by contrast, it is written only with this symbol, which is the people determinative. It does not have the land determinative. And so we conclude from this that during the reign of Merneptah, 3,200 plus years ago, Israel is a recognizable, shall I use the word ethnic or whatever, entity known to the greatest power at the time, the Kingdom of Egypt. But it was a people not associated with a particular land because they are in that Shasu type group of wandering from this place to that place. If you'd like to read a little hieroglyphs with me, this double read is the Y sound. This is an S. This tells you that you've reached the end of a syllable. This is an R. The reed and the vulture together is the Aleph sound. This is the R again because hieroglyphic script does not have an L sound. The hieroglyphic language doesn't have an L sound. So when they needed to record an L, like at the end of the word Israel, Yisrael, they used the R symbol again. It's exactly like Japanese. This tells you you've reached the end of the word. This tells you that they are shepherd or shasu type folk with a shepherd staff. And this is the people of Israel that you see here. Hieroglyphics 101. I hope you caught all that. It will be on the final exam. There you have it. The line drawing of the Merneptah stele by Flinders Petrie. I want to say a word about Professor Petrie as a sidebar. He was the founder of modern archaeology, not the founder, but one of the founders of the second or third generation of archaeologists. There were people before him in Egypt and Babylonia and so on, but he put it on a new scientific level. He thought about things like ceramic typology, looking at pottery, stratigraphy of a tell, all the stuff we take for granted today in archaeology goes back to Petrie. And I mention him in particular because my teacher, Cyrus Gordon, excavated with Petrie at a site called Tel al-Ajul near Gaza for 4 or 5 seasons back in the 1930s. I was young when I studied with Professor Gordon, who was near retirement. And Gordon was young when he dug with Petrie, who was near retirement. So it's hard to imagine that at a distance of almost 100 years, I actually am a grand disciple of the Grand Master of Flinders Petrie. He was a devout Christian, a member of the Church of England, but he was what we call an Ohev Yisrael, a lover of the people of Israel. And he requested in his will to be buried in Jerusalem. And his request was fulfilled. He's buried in the Protestant cemetery in Jerusalem. It's not open to the public. It's not easy to gain access. It's actually locked. But you need to know the person who has the keys. And I finally, know that person. And finally, in my most recent visit 3 years ago, for the first time in my life, visited the tomb of Flinders Petrie. I call it a pilgrimage to that tomb. You'll notice it's very simple. It says simply Flinders Petrie, and notwithstanding his devout Christian belief, he put an Ankh sign, the Egyptian symbol of life, up top it, which of course does evoke the Christian cross, but it's the Ankh symbol of life, eternal life for the Egyptians. That's the tomb of Sir Flinders Petrie. You'll also notice, here I am visiting the tomb, you'll also notice the stones on top, which according to Jewish tradition, one does when one visits the tomb of the deceased. The other tombs don't have them that you see here. Jews and Christians who visit the site pay homage to Flinders Petrie by following the Jewish custom of placing stone on the tomb. For me, this was, as you can imagine, a very personal, finally lifelong desire to visit the grave of the great Sir Flinders Petrie, who found Israel in the archaeological record, which is to say specifically the Merneptah stele. And just to put a face with a name, there is the statue of Merneptah in the museum in Cairo. Okay, We'll come back to the Merneptah stele one more time still. The next element in the biblical account is how Israel leaves Egypt, the Exodus. So we now go to Papyrus Anastasia number 5, also in the British Museum, same framework. I just love these Victorian era frames. What does this document say? Well, it's the report of another frontier official reporting to his superior, right? It's again, as I said, the Border Patrol, the INS, whatever you want to call them. And he mentions in the middle paragraph there that on such and such a date, actually the first paragraph already, and in the middle paragraph, on such and such a date, 2 slaves had left Egypt. And we gather from the third paragraph in particular that the Egyptian army was sent out after them. What people are after them? Write to me about all that has happened. Our scribe heard from someone else that the 2 slaves who had escaped passed through or near the city of Migdol. Okay? Sound familiar? So if you go to Exodus 14, verse 2, when the Israelites leave Egypt, they also pass through Migdol. Now, it's true that on the Egyptian eastern frontier, as you pass from arable land of Egypt into the wilderness, the arid region of the Sinai, there aren't a lot of places, but there are sufficient number of places. What are the odds that Migdol appears in this text and also in the biblical text? And so we assume, no, these aren't the Israelites, but we assume that this is a route that people leaving Egypt would take, and it helps us understand the biblical narrative. Yes, Pharaoh gave permission, but he also sent the army out after them when he changed his mind, exactly as you see here. So no, this is not a direct reference to the Israelites leaving Egypt, but it shows us that the phenomenon of the biblical story fits into known historical documentation from the same time period. All the documents that I'm showing you come from the 19th and early 20th dynasty, which is exactly the time frame of the Israelites in Egypt. When might the Exodus have occurred? We'll go through this material and then we'll take our break. Option number 1. At the end of the 19th dynasty and the beginning of the 20th dynasty, which is almost exactly 1200 BCE, Egypt descends into chaos. After Pharaoh Merneptah, who was the son of Ramses II, his son Seti II rules for a short time. But then there is no clear succession, and all manner of members of the royal family and even non-royals who are aristocrats or generals are claiming the throne until the whole 19th dynasty collapses. We have a stele found in the far south of Egypt known as the Elephantine stele. In year 1 of Setnachte, the founder of the 20th dynasty, and there it states, referring to the most recent events, this land had been in confusion because the Nile land had lapsed into forgetting God. In other words, there's chaos. Papyrus Harris, written up several decades later, during the reign of Ramses III, we'll come to him in a moment, states, looking back on that time period, the land of Egypt was cast aside with every man in his own standard of right. They had no chief spokesman. The land of Egypt was officials and mayors, right? There's no pharaoh. There's no central administration. The whole thing has collapsed. So you got a mayor here and a governor there, right? And that, I argue, option number 1, the chaos at around 1200 or 1198 BCE would have been a propitious time for the Israelites to leave Egypt. That, in fact, is the theory of my colleague Manfred Bitak of Vienna, whom I mentioned earlier, and he is correct to my mind, although there's also a second option. Here, by the way, is Papyrus Harris. This that I've translated here for you is on this papyrus, and that is not a typo. This is the longest papyrus scroll ever found. It's in the British Museum. It is 41 meters long. If I can translate that, half a football field. It's so long, the British Museum cannot display it in a single room, and it has actually been cut up into certain sections so that it could be handled and displayed. Some vignettes, including Ramses III on the right, worshiping the gods, and on the left you see some of the Egyptian texts, which I translated for you. Option number 2, and this is the one I favor for reasons which I will show you. 10 years later comes the Sea People's invasion led by the Philistines during the reign of Ramses III. These are the wall reliefs at his temple in Medinet Habu. Ramses larger than life there on the right. Notice the Sea Peoples in their boats. We know that there was a migration. The Egyptians called them the peoples of the sea. We know that there was a migration of people from the Aegean or the Mediterranean more generally who came across the sea, and they attacked the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan along the coast. This is a map of the great sea peoples. They are responsible for all manner of destructions that happen around the year 1200. The destruction of Troy, the end of the Hittite Empire, the destruction of Ugarit. All of this happens around then. They attack Egypt. Now, Egypt is strong enough to repel the Sea Peoples, who instead go up the coast of Canaan and settle in these areas over here, including the Philistines along the coast of Gaza, Ashdod, which you see on the map, and one of their allies at the city of Dor, which I excavated, as Stan mentioned in the introduction. So we know a lot about these people. Here's another map which in fact indicates Dor. Great upheavals. The Egyptians were able to repel them. They retained their independence. But look at Exodus 13, verse 17. When the Israelites left Egypt, God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines. That is to say, the easiest way to get from the Pithom and Ramses in the Delta would just go along the coast until you got into Israel. That's the way of the land of the Philistines, right here. That would get you into the land of Israel. But no, lest the people regret when they see war and return to Egypt. So we know that according to the biblical tradition, there is war happening on the coast at exactly the time when the Israelites leave Egypt. Therefore, God led them on a more circuitous route through the Sinai. I take this quite literally, that this is a memory of the Sea People's invasion at the time the Israelites left Egypt. And the point is that that would have been another propitious time, given the all hands on deck of the Egyptian army and Egyptian navy to defeat the Sea Peoples, that would have been a propitious time for the Israelites to leave Egypt as well. So we're left with two options, number 1 and 2. But I want to suggest the following. How about at other times, either earlier or later? Hence, we should think about multiple Exodus events, which were forged into a single national narrative of one Exodus of large and dramatic proportions, as described in the book of Exodus. If it helps you, here we are, 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. If it helps you, these are the early American settlements on the East Coast. English settlements, all with the exception of 1624 New Amsterdam by the Dutch, although it eventually becomes New York. 1585 Roanoke Island, which doesn't last. 1607 Jamestown, 1620 Plymouth, and all these other places that you know from American history, Salem, Boston, Providence, Newport, and so on. But what do we do as Americans? We don't celebrate each one of these exodi from England to America. We celebrate one of them, and we incorporate the national American narrative into Plymouth 1620. Whether your ancestors were on the Mayflower or not, we sit down to Thanksgiving dinner, right? That's what it means to be an American. Now, obviously, some Americans do not. Native Americans are excluded from this. Various African American communities are excluded from this. The first slave ship arrived in 1619 to Virginia. We understand that. But this informs the fabric of American culture. ad hayom hazeh, until this day. And so I use that as an analogy for multiple Exodus events which were forged into a single narrative as described in the book of Exodus. Okay, let me stop the share there, and we will pick up our narrative in a bit and invite any of the questions which may have come. Lisa, Stan, anyone writing in? Is it all that clear?
There's one. Let's see. Oh, there's two actually. Um, okay, two things. In the hieroglyphics, I can't say the word, for Ashkelon, you showed from the, maybe you should read these, Merneptah stele. There's
Right,
a lion glyph for El, presumably. Why would that not have been used for Israel?
right. Great question. So yes, in the writing out of the word Ashkelon, that the scribe did in fact use an invented L sign, which is a lion symbol for the L, but the same scribe uses the R for Israel, which is the way most Egyptian scribes did it. And here's the same scribe writing it differently. And we don't have a ready answer for that, except to say the following. It may have to do with the vowel that preceded it, and maybe the vowel before Israel gave a sense of an R sound, and the vowel before Ashkelon allowed for the L to be pronounced by the Egyptians. But I want to remind you of the following. These are scribal conventions, and here's one of them that I use when I teach. In English, we pronounce the beginning of the two Russian names, Chekhov and Tchaikovsky, exactly the same. And in Russian, they are exactly the same. But we spell the name of the author Chekhov, CH, and we spell the name of the composer Tchaikovsky, TCH. These are just scribal conventions. And so I would just leave it at that and just say, I don't know for sure, but if that analogy helps, that's how I would answer it.
And then he goes on to ask the term which is basically the same as the Egyptian term for Semites or Canaanites, comes close to being a reference by Egyptians to Israelite. Does it come close?
So the word which is definitely the Semitic word or the Canaanite word meaning people, is used by the Egyptians. By the way, not everybody accepts that. I do believe that that's the case. Some Egyptologists are a little more, doubt the equivalency, but it's fine. It's a catch-all term. It means the people, and it specifically means people from Canaan. Egyptologists frequently translate it as Asiatics. So yeah, that's a well-known Egyptian word, and it appears, by the way, in the Beni Hassan tomb inscription. I showed you the artwork in the little tomb inscription where it said 37. It actually says 37 people, right? Folk. So yeah, it's a well-known term. It does not appear in the Merneptah stele, however. So yeah.
Okay, the next question. When reading the papyri, is it read from right to left or left to right? I think you already answered.
Most of them are written right to left. Hieroglyphs can be written in either direction. I don't know if anybody's ever quantified it, but I would say 60 to 65% of the wall inscriptions, tomb inscriptions, papyri, and so on are right to left, and about 35 to 40% are left to right. It doesn't matter. They would just flip the direction of the symbols, and so you're able to determine which direction you should be reading in. Yeah.
And do we know how many papyri there are or there were?
Oh, we're talking thousands, tens of thousands. I mean, they're all over museums. Oh, maybe not tens of thousands, thousands. We don't have a good day. I mean, each museum has its own database. That's a good project for a graduate student, or maybe AI can answer it for us quickly. I don't know how many are in the British Museum, which would, I think, have the largest, or the Berlin Museum. They have the largest collections. I don't know. But thousands.
I have heard different pronunciation of the word steel as phonetically steel, steely, stella. How is it properly done?
I don't know, and say them all myself. I say Stela. Remember, not to steal. No, I say both. Stela, and it's pronounced either Stele or spelled rather Stele or Stela. I keep waiting for it to be the Wordle word for the day, and it hasn't shown up yet. But there you have it. It can go either way. Yeah.
And then I think the last of these questions is, were Phoenicians mentioned in the Egyptian writings?
Well, yes, the answer is yes. The Egyptians pronounced it as Fenchu, or they wrote it out as Fenchu, I should say, which we think is the word Phoenician. I have to mention here, by the way, that the Phoenicians didn't call themselves Phoenicians.
Oh.
The Phoenicians called themselves Canaanites. The Greeks called them Phoenicians. Keep in mind that the way you refer to your own nation may not be the way your neighbors call you. I mean, we call the country Germany, but the Germans call their country Deutschland, and the French call it Allemand. So, there's three different terms for the same place. So the Phoenicians never used the word. We have Phoenician material. They call themselves people of Canaan. The Greeks called them Phoenicians. So it's all complicated, right? But there you go. Yeah, but yes, they are mentioned occasionally in Egyptian documentation.
Thank you.
Great. Shall we go on?
Yes.
Great questions, everyone. And as I said, we'll have time at the end for more questions. Okay. So, wait a second. If the Israelites left Egypt, 1198, 1188, multiple Exodus events, then who are the Israelites in the Merneptah stele, which is 20 or 30 years earlier? The Israelites must have been in Egypt still. They didn't leave until after the year 1200. And so, the bottom text box here, I interpret the Israelites of the Merneptah stele to refer to Israelites who never participated in the Egypt experience, who continue to live in the general region of Canaan throughout the time period. The biblical account is an idealized history. Nations do not spring from the offspring of one person, that is to say Jacob/Israel. All the 12 tribes being biologically descended from him. History is much more complex. Think of American history. Think of British history with waves of migrations. The original population are the Celts, and then you get the Romans, and then the Anglo-Saxons, and then the Vikings, and then the Norman French, and eventually you get Great Britain. Israel was no different, but you tell a unified national narrative. So I think that the Merneptah stele Israelites are Israelites who happened to be there in Canaan alongside Ashkelon and Gezer and so on, who never went down to Egypt. That's the way I understand it. In fact, we have another papyrus in the Anastasi collection, Papyrus Stasi number 1, which refers to the tribe of Asher during the reign of Ramses II in the land of Canaan, when we assume, as it were, that the Israelites are supposed to be all enslaved in the land of Egypt. Here's Papyrus Anastasi number 1 in the British Museum. It's a gazetteer of the land of Canaan. It's a very long text. The scribe is describing the entire land, mountains and wadis and valleys and towns and tribal holdings and so on. And when he's in that part of the country that you see here, he mentions Megiddo, and then he mentions Asher. So this is where the tribe of Asher is according to the biblical tradition, and this is where the tribe of Asher is according to Papyrus Anastasi number 1 in the 19th dynasty. So therefore, this would be an instance of an Israelite tribe which just remained in the land. So when the next king, Merneptah, encountered Israel in the land of Canaan, it would have been Asher or other groups like them. So that's the Israelites of this major important inscription. We also know that the tribe of Dan was not originally an Israelite group at all. They were part of the Sea People's invasion. They are mentioned in the texts that I'm showing you here alongside the Philistines as their allies. So the tribe of Dan settles right alongside the Philistines. The greater Tel Aviv metropolis, to this day, is known in Hebrew as Gush Dan. Now, the tribe of Dan would have to migrate to the far north to Tel Dan, great site in the far north of Israel. So, ancient Israel had diverse origins. Core Israel participated in the essential Torah narrative. At least one tribe, Asher, and presumably others, just stayed in the land of Canaan. At least one tribe, Dan, was part of the Sea Peoples. And by the way, the biblical texts allude to the tribe of Dan and its maritime origins. And eventually they coalesce into the people of Israel. Then comes the wandering in the Sinai for the element that had been in Egypt. Well, I'm just going to show you some beautiful photographs. First, the NASA satellite. This map imposes the modern borders of Sinai, which belongs to Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia. But there are no borders in antiquity. I call this the Great Southland, right? The Sinai, the Negev, southern Jordan, northwestern Arabia, the Shasu, the Bedouin, they just are all living in that area. And if we want to traverse that area, many of these are my own photographs. I think many, if not all, I've lost track of which are my own and which I may have captured from the internet as I've traversed that area. And, you know, it's a moonscape. I mean, if anybody's ever been down south in Israel, it is, or southern Jordan, it is a empty space. The point being, we don't have any archaeological material from this area that informs the biblical tradition. There is occasionally some material that helps, but basically we're not going to find evidence of some Israelite tribes passing through this region 3,200 years ago. Occasionally the lonely acacia tree doesn't look like much, but trust me, if you spend some time in the south of Israel, that little bit of shade is so much appreciated. And occasionally one encounters a Bedouin encampment. Take a note of this. My photograph, almost 50 years old now, from one of my first trips to Israel. And we're going to come back to this photograph, as you'll see. And then the entrance into the land of Canaan, which brings us into the book of Joshua. Now, the area where the Israelites settle is the central hill country right here. Also the mountains of the Galilee and to some extent Transjordan. The flatlands, the coastal plain, was inhabited by Philistines and Canaanites. The Jezreel Valley was settled by Canaanites who used it for farmland especially. And the Israelites found a home in those mountainous areas which were basically empty at the year approximately 1200 to 1150 BCE, as we now know through the archaeology. So modern archaeologists have done a survey of the whole region, and they found that during the late Bronze Age, that is to say up until around the year 1150, it's exactly the time period that the Israelites would be arriving in the land based on the chronology of their exodus from Egypt. That during the late Bronze Age, there were only 29 settlements in this entire mountainous region that I'm showing you here. We call it the mountain spine of the country. Within 2 centuries, in what we call Iron Age 1, there are now almost 10 times as many settlements. And as another century or two pass into the Iron II period, that doubles. This explosion cannot be due to simply the natural biological reproduction of the people who were there in the late Bronze Age. It bespeaks a new people coming into the land, and those are the Israelites. So this shows you the number of settlements, and this shows you where they are in the Central Hill Country. Early stages and later stages. And that maps onto the mountainous terrain that you see here, with the Jezreel Valley separating the northern and central settlements. The work I'm showing you was done in the 1980s by Israel Finkelstein, now retired from Tel Aviv University. I have to say that Finkelstein has stepped back from what he wrote in 1988. I still accept what he wrote in 1988. The data have not changed. His interpretation of the data have changed. And I've actually told him in a somewhat humorous way, I prefer the young Israel Finkelstein to the older Israel Finkelstein. And he laughed, of course, when I told him that. But his groundbreaking work in the 1980s is what I'm teaching you today still holds. Now, what kind of settlements were these? Most of them, the initial stage of these settlements are what we call elliptical sites. They are simply an oval or elliptical construction with empty space in the middle. This kind of settlement, and they're called elliptical sites or courtyard sites. Here's those settlements bespeak the layout of Bedouin encampments. These are some early drawings and photographs from the early 20th century. What do the Bedouin do? They set up their tents in these oval, elliptical, parallelogram shapes, and the tent, the interior, therefore, creates the corral for the sheep and the goats at nighttime. And all you need is a few shepherds and a couple of sheepdogs to ensure the safety of the flock at night. And then in the daytime, they go out and they graze on this hillside or tomorrow on that hillside and so on. So when the Israelites coming out of that desert environment, which the Bible makes clear, move into the land of Canaan, they trade their tent settlements for stone settlements where they're not going to move anymore because they're settling down, what we call sedentarization. But they continue to build, as it were, or to construct the same kind of settlements so that the stone walls now create what the tents had created, the corral for the animals' safety at nighttime. Here's another line drawing of an Israelite settlement at the bottom and a Bedouin encampment at the top. Very simple, and in this case, some tents, in this case, a stone wall, and here's the house and a corral for the animals. The Bedouin encampment that I showed you, and I show you again now, you can actually see, I took this at some distance today with a better camera. I could have zoomed in, most likely better. This gives you a sense of the Bedouin lifestyle. They are disappearing as we speak. They're being settled into settled communities in Israel, in Jordan. They do it sometimes happily, sometimes not so happily. The lifestyle of Bedouin is disappearing before our eyes. But fortunately, we've captured, especially in the early 20th century, by anthropologists, the world of the Bedouin. And the Israelites of 3,000 years ago were part of that until they themselves settled down, like many of the Bedouin are settling down today. When you traverse that region, you get the occasional settlement. I mean, this is a tiny, tiny, tiny little spot right here, excavated by the archaeologists with their two vans right there. That's it, basically. A couple of stone walls, a couple of rooms, and the rest is just the corral for the animals. This is basically it. The site was excavated in 1 or 2 months. Eventually, some of these settlements are abandoned, or some of them become real villages. And so the ones that are abandoned, they move into the village. This is a typical Israelite village, Khirbet Keyafa, biblical Sha'arayim near Lachish, southwest of Jerusalem, not too far from Beit Shemesh. And the Israelites have these new villages in the Iron Age, and the distinctive marker of the Israelites are what we call the four-room house. The four-room house is comprised of 3 long rooms and a broad room along the back. 3 rooms, broad room along the back. We see this everywhere we go in Israelite sites in the archaeological record. This is a reconstruction of what a village may have looked like, with the flat roofs. Another such reconstruction based on the archaeological finds. I love these pictures, they're great. And if you go to southern Jordan today, you see the same thing. Now, this is actually an older village right here, but the government of Jordan has just built a new village for the Bedouin right here. And it looks exactly, I took this picture from a hillside looking down, 12, 15 years ago. I mean, it looks exactly like the reconstruction of these settlements here from the ancient Israelites. Nothing's changed in 3,000 years. There you have it. And some of you in Arizona, I'm being serious here, may be able to relate to the kind of house construction here, to keep the heat out, and flat roofs. In the Northeast where I live, we have pitched roofs because we get so much rain and snowfall and so on. So desert climates have their own way of constructing. This is a selection of 4-room houses from various Israelite sites. And you can see them in the image I showed earlier. Here is an actual one of the ones from a place in the Negev. 3 rooms right here, and the broad room across the back. The entrance is here. We're looking at it from the back side. Another one, this one at Isbet Sarta, which Finkelstein himself excavated. You can see the 3 rooms, they're labeled, and a 4th room along the back. There's a reconstruction of a 4-room house at the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East. Next time you're in Cambridge, Mass, go have a look. There was an upper story, and then there'd be a ladder which would lead up to the roof with an opening. So very simple lifestyles, very simple pottery, a loom there on the back wall for weaving, put a couple of pita breads out, of course, straw mats. This is the life of the Israelites. And yes, the obligatory sheep. They would bring a sheep into the house. This is alluded to in the Bible, by the way, especially in the wintertime. This is your portable heater. The sheep exude heat, and it keeps everybody in the house warm. So I hope you're all smiling, and I hope you're all loving this, as I do every time I teach this. Where do we find these 4-room houses? Look at the area. They are abundant here. They are typical here, where the Israelites lived. They're absent, especially in the Philistine area. The Israelites have a different material culture from their neighbors. This is the work of my colleague Avi Faust of Bar-Ilan University, his pathfinding book, Israel's Ethnogenesis, in 2006. By the way, you'll notice the Merneptah stele inscription of Israel here, and Israelite distinctive pottery, which we come to now as well. Israelite pots have a collared rim at the top. We call this the collared rim that you see here. These are the collared rim vessels. Okay, here's a good one, actually excavated by Finkelstein from the site that I mentioned earlier. We're all colleagues. We all share our images and our work with everyone. A whole assembly of collared rim vessels. The Canaanite pottery doesn't have that collared rim. You can store wine or olive oil in these with or without the rim. You can pour out of it with or without the rim. Think of your own vessels at home, your own jugs, your own wine bottles, right? Your own olive oil. It's a distinctive marker, however, of the Israelites, which the Canaanites did not use. Here's more of them. And the Philistines certainly didn't. Again, abundant in the region where the Israelites live. Okay, you can find some existent up here, non-existent in the Philistine region. This is what the Philistines had, decorated pottery. Why? Because the Philistines, as part of the Sea Peoples, came from the Aegean. Walk into any museum which has the Aegean pottery. It's all painted, beautiful painted pottery. The Philistines brought that tradition with them from the Aegean to the land of Canaan, and we find it in all of these Philistine sites. These are not from the Aegean. These are from the land of Israel/Canaan, where the Philistines lived. And you can see that their pottery is abundant here, non-existent or rare in the areas where the Israelites live. These are cultural markers. And to highlight that, I show you the 2 cities of Gath and Azekah, 7 kilometers, 4 miles apart from each other. Gath on the western edge of the Philistine territory, eastern edge of the Philistine territory, Azekah on the western edge of the Israelite territory. And if you look at their pottery, this can't be due to environmental reasons. They're only 4 miles apart. I mean, they basically have the same clay. It is a cultural distinction between Israelites and Philistines. Here's the map of Canaan to remind you of where all the 12 tribes settled. And we end our discussion with the following. Everything I have told you up until now, let's leave this up perhaps, you could say to me, Gary, you haven't shown us Israel anywhere. I mean, mentioned in the Merneptah stele, but all we have are four-room houses and pottery and this and that. I don't see the word Israel anywhere. I don't see an inscription that says Joshua built this, or Gideon lived here, or Deborah lived here. Right? We don't have anything in the written record, and I agree. I have given you solely archaeological material once we enter the land of Canaan. From Egypt, we have various bits of documentation, but once we move into the land of Canaan, there are no Israelite inscriptions of that time period. We actually do have a few. The alphabet is written out and so on. Clearly, a young person presumably learning to write. But we don't have any historical documentation that mentions Israel or Hebrews or any of the tribal names. That will take a few more centuries before we get there. When we finally get that material, we'll talk about that next week and the week after, where we begin to see inscriptions referring to Israel and various kings and so on. But we don't have that at this early time period. So you're now supposed to say to me at 8:10 p.m. Arizona time, prove it. How do you know these are Israelites? And the answer is here. At an excavation, you find everything, including animal bones. This is a typical box from an excavation of the animal bones, which is to say, the archaeologists and the staff and the volunteers are doing the digging. They find these things. Everything has to be cataloged, and everything is given to a specialist. If you find some metal objects, you give it to a metallurgical specialist. If you find pottery, which you do everywhere, you give it to a pottery specialist. The pottery specialist will look, if you happen to have a complete jug or most of a jug, you'll look inside. You might have olive pits or date pits or certainly pollen. That goes to a paleobotanist who will be able to tell us what was stored in that vessel. And you have people who do nothing but the architecture or the weaponry, right? Or the textiles. Whatever you find, there are now specialists. So obviously, your animal bones you are going to give to a paleozoologist. Now, this is a chart. What percentage of pig bones are found in different archaeological sites? So the three on the left, Ashkelon, Ekron, and Batash, are Philistine sites. The one on the right, Heshbon, is in Transjordan, not too far from the modern city of Amman, the capital of the Kingdom of Jordan. It was a border site shared by Israelites, Edomites, and Moabites. All three were, not Edomites, sorry, Ammonites, Israelites, Ammonites, and Moabites. All three were in control of Heshbon at different times. But the other four you see there are in the central hill country of Israel, including Shiloh, where the tabernacle was before David moved it to Jerusalem. And then Solomon built the temple that we'll see next week. So this is 0.1% at Shiloh, 0 pig bones at Aval and Radana, 1 out of 1,000 bones found at Shiloh. 1 stray pig bone out of 1,000 were found there. Who knows how it got there? And at Isbet Sarta, Finkelstein's site, by the way, Finkelstein excavated both Shiloh and Isbet Sarta. At Isbet Sarta, 4 out of 1,000 bones were pig bones. The rest are sheep, goats, cattle, all of which are permitted to be eaten, donkeys, would be the main domesticated animal. Very few horses, very few camels, things like that. Okay. Which nobody in the region ate because horses and donkeys were work animals, especially donkeys. So what this tells you is that the Philistines ate pig, and people in Transjordan ate pig, but the people of Israel at these sites did not. This is the proof that everybody agrees to. Even though Finkelstein has stepped back from some of his early work, to this day he states correctly that the single one cultural marker, how to find the Israelites in the archaeological record, How to find Israelite origins, the title of my talk this evening, is to look at the absence of pig bones. And so that's what you have here. By the way, if you've ever wanted to know what various pig bones look like, here they are. There's a pig radius and a pig humerus on the right. And just thanking my late colleague, Brian Hesse of Penn State University, America's leading paleozoologist. His wife, scholar in her own right, continues the work, but he provided me with this photograph so I could use it in my PowerPoint presentations. I love those. Love that, the pig mandible there and the maxilla with the teeth in it. So these are the pig bones you find, and a paleozoologist can identify these. They are so rare in Israelite sites, or they're absent altogether. This is clear evidence for the Israelites in the archaeological record. How do you find Israel in the archaeological record? Follow the pig bones, or the absence thereof, and at a distance of 3,200 years, you can indeed succeed in the search for Israelite origins. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Professor Rendsburg. I really learned a lot from that. I know I'm going to be following the pig bones to discovery. But we have a lot of questions here on the online chat and the Q&A rather. So the first question is, any reference to a Moses type character?
Any reference to a Moses type character? No. My late colleague, Avraham Alamat of the Hebrew University, said famously, so if Moses didn't lead them out of Egypt, then his cousin named Moses did. Which is to say, we have a story, and we can't find them in the historical record, but somehow there must have been some leader to the group, which is, of course, is what Professor Malamat was suggesting.
There's probably also Mesopotamian things that might sound like Moses.
I didn't even discuss the issues of Abraham coming from Mesopotamia tonight, but I wanted to focus on the Egyptian narrative and so on. Yeah.
So the next question is, I was taught in Sunday school that the fact that early leaders of Israel during the Exodus had Egyptian names was significant for the historicity of the story. Why would later Israelites invent this? Is the force of the argument, do you have any comments about that? Is this a legitimate argument?
Yes. So there are a number of names of the people in the Exodus generation who do have Egyptian names. Now, the question of the etymology of Moses, Hebrew Moshe, is still uncertain. Some people have claimed that it's the same name that you see at the end of Ramses and Thutmose and all those pharaohs whose names end in MS or MSS. I am less sanguine about that for complex linguistic reasons I don't want to go into, but the other problem is Aaron, Aharon. No good Egyptian etymology has come up for that. It doesn't resonate as Hebrew either, so that one is unknown. Miriam, okay, well, Yam means sea, that's perfect, and the MR is the Egyptian word for lover, so it could mean something like the lover of the sea, which would be a perfectly wonderful name for the woman who leads the Israelites in song at the crossing of the sea. Those are the big three, right? Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. There are some others in that genealogy. There's a man named Putiel. That's a good Egyptian name. But I think there's something to the argument, but it might be slightly overstated because of the lack of ability to pin, Moshe or Aharon and say, that's Egyptian.
So why 4 rooms? Did each have a specific purpose?
Yes. Well, okay. So, I may say back at you, why the split level for classic American 1960s suburbia, right? These things just happen, right? They've just become the norm. We do think that there were, in fact, the reasons for the 4-room house. Several people, including Avi Faust of Bar Ilan, have proposed that what it's a sign of egalitarianism. Every room is the same size. You can be in the middle of the house and get into either any of the other rooms equally with easy access, or upstairs. So it probably has to do with the egalitarian ethos, which Avi Faust has written about. Ditto his colleague Josh Berman, who's a biblical scholar, not an archaeologist at Bar Ilan. So there's probably some purpose to that. And I can say for sure that there are no major, huge homes in ancient Israel at that time period. In fact, you really won't get one until David's palace, and even then it's a one-off, as we'll see next week. Yeah.
Okay, the next question, I'm not, maybe you understand, but it's were these wheel thrown? Does that wheel
Oh, I
thrown?
think he's talking about the pottery, probably. He
Oh
or
yeah,
she's
yeah,
asking
that's
about
right,
the
the
pottery.
pottery. Mhm.
I don't know enough about the manufacturing of the pottery, but I'm pretty sure they are created on a potter's wheel. Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay. Is it also true that the Hebrew alphabet came from the Phoenicians?
Yes, the Phoenicians are given credit for the invention of the alphabet, which then spread throughout the region. So the Hebrews/Israelites and all the other people mentioned in the Bible, the Philistines, the Edomites, the Moabites, the Arameans, whose language was slightly distinct, borrowed the alphabet. So yes, it's basically all the same alphabet that originates from the Phoenicians.
Any bird bones, or are those too small to survive the centuries?
Wow, I don't know the answer to that. I focused on the mammals. That's a great question. Um, okay, I would imagine, doves and pigeons were being eaten and sacrificed, as we know from the book of Leviticus. I'll have to investigate that when I get back to you.
So is it fair to say, in summary, that you credit more or less the biblical narrative for the origin of the Israelites? You believe this more likely than the Israelites were merely a group that emerged and separated from Canaanites. The fact that Asher and Dan were not in Egypt favors the latter, doesn't it? And related question, how do you know Dan came from the Sea Peoples?
Right. So the question is an alternative view, which is propounded nowadays by Finkelstein. To some, I mean, everybody hedges on this. Um, you in Arizona probably know the name of the great William Deaver, who taught at the University of Arizona in Tucson, who is now 90 years old and still going strong. So wonderful. I saw Bill recently. So there is an idea that the Israelites emerged out of Canaanite civilization mainly, and maybe were informed by some group of Shasu nomad types who joined them. I see it as the opposite. The main tradition is the Shasu. I have an article called Israelite Origins. It's at my website. I can, email Lisa and Stan if they'd like to share it with the entire registered group. Some of the work that I've published on this. So that would be the Bible's just informed by desert culture. Let me just put it that way. Let me just put it to you that way. The words for tents and the words for all manner of things that relate to the desert. So I would rather see a desert group as the core of Israel, which were joined by certain Canaanite elements, whatever that word Canaanite means. Let's say people who lived in the land of Canaan, such as the tribe of Asher. As to the second part about how do we know the Dan group came from the Sea Peoples, well, they're mentioned in the Egyptian inscriptions, the word Dan. We know them from Greek inscriptions, in Greek material, where they're called the Danawoi, even from Homer. And the Bible refers to the Danites dwelling in ships in Judges chapter 5. So those are all the clues that we put together to create the idea that the Danites were amongst the Sea Peoples.
Okay, so when do we start to see barley in Israelite sites?
Oh, barley's there everywhere. Wheat and barley are domesticated almost at the same time in Neolithic times, 5 or 6 thousand years before we reach the time period we're talking about. Wheat and barley are everywhere in Egypt, Canaan, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, throughout the entire region. Yeah.
There has been a recent reinterpretation of an inscribed text in a mine in the Sinai as mentioning Moses, question mark.
Yes, well, there are a set of inscriptions at a turquoise mine in western Sinai, not too far from what is today the Suez Canal, where the Egyptians mined the turquoise with Semitic workmen, and they actually have a temple to the goddess Hathor there, and they're from the general time period we're talking about. We can read the script to an extent, and one scholar has suggested that the word Moses appears there. With all due respect to the scholar who has said this, and he is a colleague whom I admire, I just don't think his reading on this one is correct. I don't know if everybody will get the pun, and I didn't say it, but when he proposed this at a conference once, that the name Moses appears in the inscriptions found at this turquoise mine, one of my other colleagues says it cannot be because that would make Moses out to be a minor prophet. Ha, 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 ha. Okay.
I think it's a good joke. Okay, so I believe there is a fresco with King Shishak who lists among his war conquests the Hebrews. I think it is referenced in Kings in the Bible.
We'll talk about it next week. He does not. Shishak is mentioned in the Bible. We'll see that next week. And we have Shishak's inscriptions about his conquests in the land of Canaan, including Megiddo and other places. But he doesn't mention Israel. So we put the two together. The biblical reference matches perfectly with the Egyptian material at the end of the reign of King Solomon and the beginning of the reign of King Rehoboam. We'll see this next week. But he doesn't mention Israel specifically. He mentions places in the land of Canaan, which might have been more under Canaanite control than Israelite control at that time. Yeah.
So if the tribe of Dan was the part of the Sea Peoples, were they Danoi, like the Philistines were from Crete? And is it that they were? Is it, and if why they is that why they had ships and the Song of Deborah? Is this what Yigal Yadin has proposed?
Yes, as I said in answer to the prior question, they are the Danoi of Greek epic. And yes, they are dwelling in ships in Judges chapter 5, the Song of Deborah. And this was proposed by my teacher Cyrus Gordon, whom I showed earlier, and by Yigal Yadin at more or less the same time back in the early to mid 1960s. It's a question of whether most scholars accept it or not. As you can see, that I do. Yeah.
Any mention of a series of plaques in the Egyptian writings, or plagues? I'm sorry, plagues in the Egyptian writings.
Well, we have in Egyptian texts references to plagues which are similar to the biblical ones. Today I was, today I had my historian hat on. If I were presenting the biblical story, it's a whole different lecture, the biblical story in the light of Egyptian literary text, the biblical story in the light of, so we do have the Nile turning into blood, and we have something about darkness, and we even have the death of the firstborn. Again, I've published on this, and I can direct the questioner to some of my publications on that. But that falls outside the historical reconstruction that we are attempting to do today, and we'll stay with history in the next two sessions as well.
Are there any modern day areas of Israel that have houses grouped together like in ancient Israel, or like what you showed in Jordan, I suppose?
Not that I can think of. I mean, it's possible that some of the Bedouin villages near Beersheba are being built in a similar way to the Bedouin village that I showed in Jordan. But I don't have a ready, my general answer would be no, and I don't have a ready answer one way or the other, though. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. No. So that's the end of our online Q&A. So we have 3 minutes left. So if I may ask, what can you tell us about what it was like studying with Cyrus Gordon?
Well, as we call him, Cyrus the Great, evoking the name of the great Persian emperor. So he was a master. As one of my fellow students said, we were exposed to many, many great scholars in the 20th century. Most of them were not good pedagogues. Gordon was a master in the classroom. He knew every single language of the ancient Near East, Semitic and non-Semitic. As one of my Israeli colleagues once said about him, Koresh hu melech hasafot. Cyrus was the king of the languages. He wrote the standard grammar on Ugaritic and dictionary of Ugaritic. And his work was just, he had such broad horizons. He could quote Greek material, Mesopotamian material, Egyptian material. He really knew everything. The only person who came close to him in breadth was the great W.F. Albright of Johns Hopkins. So I was privileged. That's the only word, to be amongst his last of his doctoral students. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that recollection. And
Yeah.
thank you, Professor Rendsburg, for sharing your knowledge with us tonight and for being here with us. Please join us for the following two programs. And if we were in person, I would ask people to join us in a round of applause. But if you do that digitally, we'll send you good feelings. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Stan. Thanks, Lisa.